I think now we'll get on to the story that I want to tell you, the story of Author Stace and the story of eternity. Author Stace was born in the slum area of Sydney, Balmain. He was one of 5 children, 2 sisters and 2 brothers. They didn't sleep in the home, they slept under the house on bags. The parents were nearly always drunk, so invariably there was no breakfast. So the children used to run along the street, grab milk if they could find it on the doorsteps of people. Anywhere they could find a scrap of food, they'd take it in a shop and grab a sweet or grab something. And that's how he lived. And by the age, well, let me see, he had 2 brothers, 2 sisters, and they all became drunken, and they all died drunken derelicts, which was very sad. One woman ran a brothel. They weren't a nice type at all. At the age of 12, he became a ward of the state. Hardly had any education at all, and at the age of 14, he was down in the South Coast looking for work. First job at 15. All he wanted was the pay so he could go to the hotel and drink. And what happened? Well, he always lost his job, and he was always put in jail for a little time, and he went from one job to the other. He said, I would find a job, I would find a hotel, I would find a policeman, and I would find a jail. And that's how he lived. What a life. And he went further and further down, but war came. And off he went to the front line in World War I. And because he was a little fellow, only 5'3", he was made a stretcher bearer. He wasn't long in World War I. Then he came back from World War I, and it was coming on to Depression years. And he just went further and further into sin. He was a drunkard, he was a petty thief, he was a criminal, he was in the underworld for some years, he was a scout for brothels, he was a cockatoo, and that was someone who watched that the police weren't coming for 2-up gaming schools. He was a terrific drinker. He drank everything, went from rum, gin, whiskey and methylated spirits. There wasn't much else he could do. He was desperate, really. He used to sometimes go to the police and say, put me in jail, put me in jail. And they wouldn't take any notice of him. But he got to the stage where he was almost put into a mental asylum. But isn't the Lord wonderful? The Lord had another plan for this drunken sot. And on the 6th of August, 1930, he saw outside a church, St Barnabas Church in Broadway, Sydney, a little notice. And it said, meeting Wednesday night for a cup of tea and a rock cake at the end. And he thought to himself, my, if I could get a cup of tea and a rock cake, I wouldn't mind going in there. So night came, and sure enough, the room was filled with about 300 needy men. And he sat near the back, pretty ragged looking, and he looked down and he saw near the front row some well-dressed men. And he said to his criminal mate, who are they? And the mate said, well, I think you call them Christians. They were the workers. And he thought, I wish I could be like that. And he sat there and he listened to a godly man, Archdeacon Canon Hammond. And Hammond, of course, gave the gospel. And Author Stace listened. Was there any hope for a man like him? Could he ever get a different lifestyle? And at the end of the service, he listened. He went and got his cup of tea and a rock cake. He crossed over the road to University Park, and there was a great Moreton Bay fig tree. And he got on his knees and he wept his way to the foot of the cross. And he said, Lord, you're everything to me now. I don't want my old life. I want a new life. And when you really come to Christ and you're really converted, the old life passes away. You don't want the old life anymore. And he was a new man. And he had a very interesting time. He ran some meetings, some prayer meetings. God gave him amazing ability. He got out in the open air. He'd lead the open air meetings. He would visit some of these men's shelters. He would go to churches. He would give his testimony, and immediately God used him. That was 1930, the 6th of August 1930, when he was converted. 2 years later, in 1932, in November, my father was holding a mission in a church called Burton Street Baptist Tabernacle in the heart of Sydney, very much the heart of Sydney, near the well-known street, Oxford Street. And it was in this church, where it was a big Baptist church, and the mission was on. And one night, the 14th of November, 1932, my father was preaching from a verse in Isaiah about the high and lofty one that inhabits eternity. And Author Stace was there, and he was listening, and he began to cry because suddenly my father said, eternity, eternity. Oh, that I could shout and sound eternity all over the streets of Sydney. You've got to meet eternity. How will you face it? And he listened, and he felt the Lord saying to him, go out and write eternity on the street. Oh, he said, how could I? I can barely write my own name for 100 quid. I couldn't spell the word eternity. He felt in his pocket, and out came a piece of chalk. And he went outside and he bent down and he wrote eternity in copper plate. He couldn't believe it, but he'd done it. And then the Lord gave him that amazing ministry of writing eternity for 35 years on the streets of Sydney and on the streets. He moved around a bit to some of the suburbs, and would you believe it, but they believe that in 35 years he wrote the word 500,000 times. Isn't that amazing? Ah, yes, he was accosted by the police at times, but he always said, well, that's God's word and I'm writing it. And he used to, and this is what I think is so wonderful, he used to get up about 4 o'clock in the morning, and he would spend time praying and saying, Lord, where will I go today to write that word? I saw it on quite a few occasions, but I'm quite sure that it was the prayer behind that word that has made that word live on. And so he had an amazing life. He married much later in life. He was a member of Burton Street Baptist Tabernacle, and he was well known and well loved. And he passed away in 1967. My father was part of the funeral. We didn't hear so very much about that. Perhaps a few people, well, a lot of people had seen the eternity, but nothing specific had ever been done. But in the 1990s, a film was brought out. It was a documentary of 60 minutes, and it was the eternity story. People had got interested, and actually one of the men who was putting on the film came to my home. It was about 1992 when he came, and my mother was still living. And I remember he asked us a lot of questions about Author Stace. He'd heard all about this. And we said to him, if you're doing a film, unless you put the true story and his conversion, don't do your film. But they did do it. They did a very good film for people who were not Christians. And it came out in 1994. and it created quite a lot of interest. They showed it for several months at one of the theatres in Oxford Street, and a lot of people were interested in the story. And then, of course, later, in the end of the 1900s, when it came to the year 2000, you know what happened. In a great thrill, Eternity was put on the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
Wow.
And that was marvellous because it brought the word absolutely into people's minds. And I believe that those people who were gathered that night, as people always gather when it's the beginning of the new year, and evidently when Eternity came on the bridge, there was a tremendous scream, a cry, as people often recognised it in those days. So that was the year 2000, and that caused a great interest then. And you found people wrote tracts about Eternity, about the story. People were interested in it. They wanted to know more of the story. We often saw it outside a church, which was very interesting. And it's absolutely quite amazing what has happened with that little word. It's never been forgotten. It's brought people. Now, Eternity has also been written in the city in an interesting place. In Town Hall Station, there's an arcade that goes to the big school, St Andrew's School, and there's a waterfall and a cafe, and right at the foot of the waterfall is the word Eternity. It's been put there by actually the architect of that whole area, who I know, and there it is for all to see. And the cafe is the Eternity Cafe. And over the years, it's become more and more the Eternity Cafe. And one of the walls has the whole outline in ink, as it were, of the city. And there's the little man writing Eternity, which is very interesting. And he's an interesting man who runs it. We've got to know him because we've been every time we're in Sydney. We go to it. And it's lovely to think that there you are. You've got the Eternity Cafe, and outside you've got a message for people to see. Central Railway also has an Eternity Cafe, and they have a great big sheet with the whole story told. So the word has gone on, and I believe it's gone on, and it will go on, because Author Stace, when he actually wrote that word, had prayed every time that God would use it. And only eternity will reveal how many have come to know the Lord as a result of his faithful praying. And about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, Roy Williams and Elizabeth Myers wrote the book Mystery Eternity. Now, it's a wonderful story, and it's a story that, of course, is the story I've just told you with a lot more detail, but it's very, very well done. And when the first copy actually that came, I think Roy Williams wanted me to have the first copy, and so he asked the head of Bible Society, they printed the book, if they would bring the book down for me to have. And they did, and in it Roy Williams had written, "I'm sure you will enjoy this book. I think I have done justice to your extraordinary Father." And I thought, isn't that lovely? And it does. It's lovely, and it gives the real story of eternity. They still have it, Kurong. There's no Kurong here, but Kurong still has the book, and they still use it.
They have Kurong in Launceston.
Yes, they do, and that's where they would have the book. It's a wonderful story, and we just go on praying that the Lord will show people that eternity means the lifetime of the Almighty, and we need to know him and have the Lord as our Saviour in order to spend eternity with him. So thank you, folk. That's a brief account of the story, but it does give you an idea, a little bit, of the man who God changed, the gifted man my father was in preaching, and the way the Lord has blessed the work over the years.